As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Haiti enjoys an exalted status in history, and rightfully so. And given what we have seen today, with impeding imperial forces looking to invade Haiti, word of gangs, and we already know we cannot trust the Western liberal media, I felt it important and imperative to speak to my brother and comrade, Kweku Lumumba, in which I was had a fortunate experience of sharing a platform with, in which we discussed Palestine, Cuba, Assata Shakur, and beyond. So today, to talk all things Haiti, welcome to the Malcolm Effect, my brother. How are you?
I am feeling really good to be with right-minded comrades, and I hope that we can have a conversation that makes me feel even better. So thank you.
I'm extremely looking forward to this conversation. I'm glad we were able to do this. And joining me is a voice you are familiar, my co-host Christian Joseph. Take it away, Christian.
For sure. What's good? So first question, Momodou kind of alluded to it in the beginning. Haiti is well known in the world and especially amongst Black people worldwide for being the first free Black republic, freeing itself from slavery. But post-revolution, Haiti has not been without its problems, especially in recent history. I mean, through through a lot of its history, but especially in recent history. So, could you talk a little bit more about Haiti's recent leadership? From the 20th century going into now, who are Duvalier, who is Aristide, who is Jovenel Moïse, and who are and how did these different eras kind of lead us into the moment that we're in now?
That's a tremendous topic for discussion, and I think that'll carry us all the way through if we let it. But once again, I'm grateful for the invitation to have this kind of conversation. I think it's much needed because oftentimes when people talk about Haiti, it is in the context of the revolution that was successful in liberating the space, the entire island, actually, from colonization and enslavement, and establishing an empire that would advance that paradigm across the world. But then it's like history goes dark for centuries. And then people ask, well, how did we get here? What happened? What happened to the revolution? Well, it's been 220 years. There's a lot that's happened. And so the 21st century conversation is very important in understanding the recolonization of Haiti. And really it extends back farther than that. But for the sake of the question, let's start with the 21st century. So we have these leaders or these heads of state, we should say, because there are a lot of leaders in Haiti, a lot of them who don't get the spotlight of a head of state. They organize. Haiti, of the places that I've spent significant time in the world, Haiti is one of the most well organized places from top to bottom, left to right. And that's not because of the government or the heads of state. That's because of the people and the culture. And so you have so many community organizations. Whatever somebody wants to do, they don't tend to go as an individual. The psychology that extends from the culture is let's do it together. Let's organize. Let's mettre tête ensemble. Combit. That those things that are in the language because they are part of the culture come out in the activities. And so there are many leaders, and there have been many leaders, and there will continue to be many leaders because the culture stays intact. And that is one of the things, before we get into who these leaders are, these heads of state, if you will, that is one of the things that colonizers have been seeking to undermine in Haiti since the beginning. That culture that gives birth to community and collectivism and what we would call socialism prior to Marxism. We have to make that clear too, and hopefully we can get to that in this conversation as well. So People know that Jovenel Moise, who was the last president of Haiti, was assassinated in 2021. And so, who was he? Who was his predecessor? Who? What was the party? Who was Aristide? Who were the Duvaliers? Jovenel Moise was not a politician. He is someone who, in an even more remarkable mode than a Barack Obama in the United States, seemed to come out of nowhere. And that's because he did, as far as politics are concerned. He was a businessman, and he was somebody who was handpicked by his predecessor, Martelly, who could not run because the Constitution would not permit someone who was already a president to run a successive term. They could serve up to 10 years, so they could serve 2 terms, but not successively. So what had been put in place since the earthquake in 2010 is a new party paradigm that would allow for a state control of a single party with rotating heads of state. So you see the PHTK or the PHTK, the men in pink, or the bald head party, as some people call them in different ways, because they had a color which was pink, and then they had the party acronym, or the initialism stands for men in bald head party. So Martelly, who was not a politician either, so you're starting to see a trend. He was a musician. He was not involved in politics at all. He was handpicked by the U.S. State Department, that at the time was being run by Hillary Clinton, to be the head of state, even though in the election of that year, he was the third runner up. So you have this trend now of people who do not have political experience being handpicked to be heads of state so that they can be manipulated. So Michel Martelly did his thing for 5 years, and then he handpicked Jovenel Moise to be his successor. And the trend continued. Jovenel did not win the election in 2015. So what happened, as he was the runner-up, what happened is there was a whole coalition of candidates who formed an opposition to the rigged election in 2015, which then delayed it until 2016, where they had a re-election, or a recount, if you will, but it really was a revote. And in 2016, the fix was still in, and Jovenel Moise became president. So you have these figures that, if he hadn't been assassinated, then Michel Martelly was poised to run again after Jovenel's term was up. And if not, then it would have been someone else who was part of that party apparatus that could form that rotational cycle of control and puppeteering from the U.S. State Department. And I keep mentioning the U.S. State Department because it is very clear and very upfront that they are the lead colonizers in this era of Haiti. So let's go a little bit farther back from these two figures to the other person you met, Aristide. Aristide is a mixed bag, if you will, because unlike Martelly, unlike Jovenel Moise, he started off as the man of the people. After the ouster of Baby Doc, from the Duvalier regime that extended from the 1950s all the way to the late 1980s, the people were ready to have a leader of their choosing. And so there's a gap time, though, between the election and between the ouster happening in 1987, and then the election in 1990. There's this 3-year period. And so you have this opportunity in which colonizers, namely the U.S. State Department, looks at IET and says, okay, there's a wave of popular movement towards democracy, and populist democracy, not the mode of democracy that the United States uses and calls democracy, but populist democracy, actually majority rule. And the United States was not in a position to get ahead of it or to stop it. So then they had to vet the candidates. The candidate that rose to the top was Aristide, and the CIA had to determine, well, is this somebody that we can manage? And they determined that yes, it is someone that over time they could manage. What they did in order to manage him was they established a proxy intelligence agency in Haiti. And in that intelligence agency, we see the same people who then organize a coup against Aristide right after he's elected. That's not a coincidence. That is part of the managing or manipulation tactic. So, okay, we're going to let you guys have your election. We're going to let you guys have your popular candidate, Aristide, but we're going to put in an apparatus to overthrow him and jeopardize his life and his well-being so that we can manipulate him. And that's exactly what they did. So that happened. You see the first coup. And then when he's brought back, he's able to be president again. And then you see another coup happen. And this is all part of the manipulation from both the Bill Clinton and George W. Bush eras. And how it is that they manipulate him and what the result is by threatening his life and his well-being and showing that they actually have the real power in Haiti. They propose different things, policies to put in place. One of the most infamous policies that we see come into play right now is the policy of imported rice from the United States. You would think that Haiti doesn't grow its own rice, but it does. And it's of better quality than any imported rice that they could receive. So, what is the benefit then of a Bill Clinton, who was president at the time, manipulating the situation with ICE? Well, it's a profit motive because a lot of that rice was coming from Arkansas. And we also have Florida rice, to the Miami rice. But the issue here, beyond the undermining of the economy in Haiti, the undermining of the peasants, the undermining of the agricultural sector that takes up about 80% of the economy, is that we now know, if we didn't know before, everybody knows now, that the rice that has been subsidized so that it's cheaper to buy in Haiti, which is how it undercuts the economy, is toxic. So the rice that they are sending in Haiti is toxic, so much more so to the Haitian people than it would be to anyone in the United States for two reasons. Number one, it is at least twice as toxic, and we're talking about heavy metal toxic, things that humans should not be consuming in mass. Heavy metals like arsenic, cadmium, twice as toxic as any rice that is grown in Haiti. The issue here is now that the Haitian people eat several times more rice than the average US citizen. So when you multiply that double dose of toxins, things that cause developmental disabilities, things that cause a wide range of psychological issues, then you have a situation in which they are directly attacking the culture. Because in Haiti, for anyone who's Haitian who's listening, or anyone who's been there for any significant amount of time, you know, if you eat a meal, you're going to eat rice. At some point in the day, every single day, you're going to have rice. And you're going to have a lot of it. Papa Haitien love rice. So that's a direct attack on the culture of the people. And we see how that becomes a factor, especially in the 21st century, because I want to add something to this biological warfare of the 21st century that is happening and being facilitated through the manipulation of these heads of state that you talked about. You see the technology that we're using right now and how prevalent it is and how accessible it is to our people around the world. Well, what happens when we upgrade our phones? What happens when we discard our laptops and upgrade to the newest model? Where does the old stuff go? We never think about that. Well, it gets shipped to IT and other places like it, and it ends up in the soil. And these heavy metals from these items of the 21st century end up leaching into the soil, into the foods, into the water supply, and then affecting a generation of people. One of the main chemical components of these items, this garbage, is lead. And we already know that lead contributes to heightened aggressive behaviors and violence in adolescence. So when we look at the turn of the 21st century and the upshoot of all of this technology and how we're going through technology at a rapid pace. Every year we need to get a new laptop. Every year we need a new phone. So all of this stuff is just piling up in the soil of Haiti for an entire generation that are now adults. And these are the same adults that are fighting in the streets of Haiti, this heightened aggression over the course of one generation in a nation that prior to was more peaceful than neighboring Jamaica. So I didn't even touch on the Duvaliers because I wanted to give some time for some feedback, but I just wanted to at least go back and give people a snapshot of certain manipulations that have been happening, with, at least with three major heads of state over the period of about 30 years, and how the colonizers are attacking our culture in Haiti. And we need to be cognizant of that so that we can fight back.
Thank you for that. I think what is most interesting about your response is like, especially with the mention of the biological warfare and the import of rice, is also, an imperialist undermining of the economy. And I kind of want to get you to speak a little bit more on, the economic role that Haiti plays within the larger, within the Caribbean and the world at large. Kind of what is their economic position? And the reason I think this is interesting is because on the eve of the revolution, Haiti was the most lucrative colony, French colony, and arguably the most lucrative colony. Period. So, with a lot of agricultural, a lot of resources agriculturally. So, could you talk a little bit more about like what are Haiti's major resources? Why is the U.S. State Department so interested in it as a nation from that political economic perspective?
Sure. Thank you for that question. And I want to start with what you mentioned as far as the prosperity of the colony, the French colony prior to the revolution. We see how the French used this space to be what they call the Pearl of the Antilles. And it was that way because it was the most profitable colony in it was really the most profitable colony in the Western Hemisphere. And after the revolution, the successful phase of the revolution in 1804, we see a dip in production. And some people would try to use that to say, well, African people don't know how to manage economy. It's better under European control, and they know they should be in control of economy. The reason why the economy dipped is primarily, first and foremost, imagine a world in which you are enslaved. You and your family and your community is enslaved. And everyone else around you, in every state around you, is enslaved. These are slave states. These nations around you promote slavery. And they negotiate their major trade between one another as they emerge is slaves, enslaved people. You liberate yourself. You and your family and your community liberate yourself and take claim of one of these states, one of these spaces. You have abolished slavery. So you're not willing to trade in human beings. You're not engaging in that economy. You're not recognized by the rest of these racists. You're not recognized for trade, for economy, an economy of scale. You're not participating in one of the key factors of economic trade of the time. And so, of course, on principle, the revolution degraded the economy that existed in IET because it was changing the paradigm. So that has to be understood. So when people say, well, they didn't know what they were doing, they knew what they were doing. They were operating according to values that said it's not acceptable to trade and prosper in human beings and human lives. The other thing is IET invested its economy in liberation in other places. And so that drained economy. That was a drain on economy to say, instead of investing in exploitation of peoples, we're going to invest in liberation of peoples. And that continued even after the death or assassination of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. That continued. So credit to those who, even though they were traitors, they upheld at least that mode of the Haitian Revolution to say, well, we'll continue to invest in the abolition of enslavement everywhere and for liberation movements, decolonization movements in other places as well. And they did that. For that, there was a price to pay. And when I say that, I mean those two aspects. Number one, in order to be recognized by these other nations, there was a price to pay. People talk highly about this freedom fee or debt that was paid to France. I do not want to give credit to the French for that completely, because they weren't the ones who proposed it. It was a faction of the traitors of the revolution who proposed it, because they wanted to be recognized by France. So you have an Alexander Pétion, you have his successor in a Boyer, who, as heads of state, in keeping with your previous question about these so-called leaders, they proposed to France, to the king of the time, to say, we'll pay you in order to recognize us as a nation, as a free and independent nation. Pétion's offer got declined. Boyer picked it up and said again, it was like 15 million francs. And his was rebutted, and another offer was given. He said, we won't take it for 15 million francs. We'll do it for 150 million, which Aristide made a big deal about that being approximately $21 billion in today's currency. So you have this betrayal of these certain principles that would have allowed for the economy to rebound eventually, as decolonization efforts and anti-enslavement efforts were successful in the Western Hemisphere. But these particular traders did not allow for the economy to rebound in that way, because they betrayed the revolution in a way that they sold it out to the French. So we have to be clear about that. And then moving forward, as far as what is the viability of the Haitian economy, let's jump. Let's fast forward much further in time to modern day, because in the modern day, the media and many corporate media outlets like to say Haiti is the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. Haiti is extremely poor. They suffer from an inordinate amount of poverty. But like much of the so-called third world, Haiti is rich with natural resources and human resources. But let's just stick with the natural resources, because people know that the United Nations was occupying the island from 2004 to 2017. And this was under the auspices of a peacekeeping occupation to maintain some stability so that politics and economy can operate. What people don't know is that the United Nations was also facilitating excavation of resources and scouting certain resources like gold, to see how much gold is in the mountains, to see how much iridium is there. And if the listeners have never heard of iridium, that's because it's an extremely rare mineral. It's not something that you find in your backyard anywhere in the world. It's not something that you find in the highest mountains anywhere in the world. It's something that you find predominantly, as we know, in Haiti and South Africa. And the reason why we don't find it all over the world is because it's not from this world. It, as far as we know, it was deposited on Earth through interstellar meteor engagement, and so you had this mineral impact Earth, and then happen to break up and land in these places that we now know as Haiti and South Africa. And this particular mineral is extremely important, going back to your 21st century question, to the 21st century age of technology and technological advancement. They needed, when I say they, I'm talking about the imperialists, the colonizers of Haiti, namely the United States, because the United States is not the only imperialist force in the world, but the United States is desperate to maintain its hegemony, not only over the Western Hemisphere, but its military hegemony over the entire planet. And in order to do that, it has to continually fuel a military industrial complex and stay one step, at least one step ahead of all the other military powers in the world. So exploiting a rare earth mineral like iridium to power to put into its machine and its machinery is invaluable. because the Russians don't have access to Haiti, and they want to make sure the Russians don't have access to Haiti. So that's why that control of that space is so important. And today, when we see these things going on, that's why control of spaces with AFRICOM, and I know I'm spreading out from Haiti a little bit, but it's connected to the imperialist purview of the United States and the State Department to say we need to control spaces like Haiti because they have something that most places in the world don't. And beyond that, of course, there are a lot of minerals that have not yet been exploited for the benefit of the people in Haiti. We know that under the waters of Haiti, because of these excavations that have been happening, these explorations, these surveys, we know that Haiti has larger oil reserves than Venezuela, untapped oil reserves, which means if the people of Haiti had a government that was autonomous and represented their interests first and foremost, then Haiti could be the richest nation in the Western Hemisphere again. It could do what Venezuela did times two, as far as being able to exploit its resource of oil and invest it in the nation for advancement. So, the reason why Haiti remains the so called poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere is complete manipulation. If things had gone the way that we wanted them to go when we led our populist movement outside of the dictatorship of the Duvalier regime, then we would be in a position where we could control those resources for the benefit of our people and the benefit of others. Just as Venezuela was able to benefit Haiti with its oil, Haiti will be able to return that favor and then offer that favor to other nations. And so the economic potential of Haiti is still tremendous. All of these resources have not been extracted. They're still there. The gold is still there. The iridium is still there. The oil is still there. The rich soil that allows for the harvesting of all of these crops that are healthier to consume and would be healthier for other people in other islands to consume for export are still there. The people are still there. Well, they're there, but they're terrorized and being forced to disperse. But as far as the population growth represents a growing potential workforce. So the potential of IET is tremendous economically. It's just that it's been, like you said, brother, undermined deliberately, and we have to recognize that dichotomy.
Thank you so much for that elaborate response and a much needed one of that. And thank you so much for what I'm hearing at the end of your response is making the case for a Pan Africanist analysis of Haiti. So, given the contemporary situation on the ground right now and the images that we're seeing of Haiti, how do we begin to understand what is happening today in Haiti?
Well, by having conversations like this, so thank you again, and
Hmm.
putting the now in historical context, and not necessarily a historical context of several hundred years ago or a few hundred years ago or even generations ago, but let's just stick with the conversation of the last 30 years, the end of the 20th century and the turn of the 21st. People make a lot about men with guns being revolutionaries, as if killing someone or being willing to kill someone makes one a revolutionary. And it's sad that it has been reduced to that. Because if that's the case, all of these people who are killing people indiscriminately in the streets of the United States are revolutionaries. And we know that's not the case. So let's take a step back from the imagery that's being forced upon us that these men with guns, primarily in Port-au-Prince, in the capital of Haiti, are revolutionaries. We have to ask ourselves, who are they fighting against? If we answer that question, if anyone who's watching that and listening to this conversation answers that question honestly, then that alone will upend the whole conversation about them being revolutionaries. Because Haiti is in such a unique position right now. There is no occupying force in Haiti. The United Nations peacekeeping force is gone. There's no U.S. Marine force occupying Haiti. Yes, we know that there were Marines sent down to Haiti to evacuate the embassy, the U.S. embassy, but that's par for the course. That's what they would do anywhere in the world. They're not there to occupy or to fight anybody. The Haiti doesn't have a military. So they're not fighting a proxy military that is the Haitian military. And the police have been disbanded for a long time. In fact, we know that the police who are still there are their own gang because they're not getting paid by the government. Even before Jovenel was assassinated, the police would routinely go months before getting paid. So who's paying them to be the national police? Who are they working for? They're a gang as well. They're fighting for turf. So these gangs, these mercenaries in IT are not fighting against any occupying force. If they were actually revolutionaries, especially now that the proxy appointed prime minister Ariel Henry has stepped down and he's not even in the country anymore, there is nothing stopping them from getting together if they were actually revolutionaries and saying, we've successfully liberated the nation. We are now the leading or ruling council of IET. They could do what they could easier do in IET what the military factions have done in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. They could do that easier right now in IET, but they're not. Instead, you hear them talking about, oh, civil war. There's going to be civil war. What revolutionary in a position to liberate a space for its people is talking about we're gonna advance civil war, which does nothing for the people there. So that's number one. Who are they fighting against? They're not fighting against any imperialist force. They're not fighting against any occupying force. Their enemy is the Haitian people. They're kidnapping the Haitian people. They're killing the Haitian people. They're extorting the Haitian people. They're not killing a single oligarch. They're not taking over a single oligarch's business. They're not doing what would happen in the Cuban Revolution when Castro and his crew of revolutionaries won and took over the oligarchy's space. And the oligarchy is the one who ran to Florida. Those are the people who initially left Cuba, fled Cuba, and ran to the United States, the oligarchs. But we don't see that in Haiti. Who's coming to the United States? Who's fleeing Haiti? The average person. The average person is selling their land if they own any land. Not that they're an oligarch, because people in Haiti, and especially in the countryside, own land. So they're selling that for a plane ticket and an opportunity to get to Chile, to get to Panama, to get to the United States. So they're selling everything that they own and in effect becoming poor to flee this gang violence. That's not uprooting the oligarchs and liberating the space for the average Haitian. That's maintaining a status quo and fighting for turf to defend their financial backers, who are the oligarchs. So we have to be clear about these gangs, so-called revolutionaries, and clear mercenaries. The people in IET that are actually revolutionaries are not getting the spotlight. The people in IET who are actually revolutionaries have already committed not to use guns. Why? Because they understand that these guns are being sent into Haiti to destabilize the nation. And so currently, there's no way for the real revolutionaries to take guns, take up arms, and fight against these mercenaries without also contributing to the destabilization that's happening there. And also, the media will quickly brand the real revolutionaries as rebels or terrorists that need to be put down. That's no question. So it's strategic. So what are the revolutionaries actually doing? They are providing safe spaces. Like I'll speak for the organization that I represent internationally, COSA, which stands for Combat Citoyen Socialiste pour Sauver Haïti. We're headquartered in the south of Haiti. People are fleeing Port-au-Prince en masse into the south. And in the south, which is the capital is Okai, you have revolutionaries setting up clinics to provide medicine for people who are injured and ill. You have revolutionaries setting up spaces where people can get food so they can eat because they're starving. You have revolutionaries providing opportunities for children to continue their education because their schools have been destabilized and destroyed and their parents can't afford it anymore. You have revolutionaries raising the alarm about cholera, another agent of chemical warfare that was introduced during the UN occupation. Raising the alarm, and also in this clinic space, providing clean products so that they can use, clean water so that they can drink, the sterilization agents, sanitization agents, and also medicine for those who have already been affected by cholera. You don't see the gangs doing any of that, any of it. Why aren't the people of Haiti who are poor and destitute fleeing to the protection of these gangs if they're actually revolutionaries? Why are they running away from them? Why are they being kidnapped by them? Why are they being extorted with roadblocks where people who are doing business, the average business person, the average merchant in Haiti is being extorted by these gangs? When they travel to do trade, they meet a roadblock. And in order to pass this roadblock, they have to sign a document, which we've seen the document, saying that they'll pay basically the extortion fee so that they can move their products around or they'll get killed. And then they have to have this paper whenever they go around and say, hey, I'm one of the guys who is paid up. That's extortion. So these people are not revolutionaries. These are people who are agents of destabilization that is facilitated by the oligarchy. And the United States now, primarily because we see them offering up $300 million to the highest bidder to take up a police force that will come into Haiti to then reclaim the space for the United States so they can do their fake elections. So we have to be clear about that. And once we're clear on that, then we'll know who to support and how to support and make sure that the truth be told so that when this is over, because it will be over eventually, the United States will get rid of its puppets or manage its puppets. When it's over, we'll be on the right side of history and we can organize correctly.
Thank you. Go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, so to follow up on that, like given what you've described as a very unique situation in which there's almost which you could describe as a vacuum, what opportunity is now presented to provide a vision for Haiti as a country that can truly use its resources for its people, for itself? The contradictions that are occurring right now, how can they be resolved in a way that can be revolutionary or liberatory for Haitian people?
Well, what I'll say is probably going to be controversial, but that's okay. Haiti was never meant to be a nation state. And when you look at the history of the nation, there's always a flux. And it doesn't you see it in a way in Haiti that you don't really see it in other nations. At, at least especially in this region of the world, but almost anywhere for a nation that has the same length of life as Haiti. And that's because there's always been differences of opinion about what Haiti is and what it's supposed to be. You had some who immediately said they wanted to do a republic, and they did it in the South. You had some who wanted to preserve some sort of monarchy, and they did it in the North. And I'm mentioning right after the revolution was betrayed, 1806. You had the republic established. You have a kingdom established in the North. So you have a president in the south of the island. In Pétion, you have on King Christophe in the north. You have these different forms of government that are operating in the same space, pretty much. And then you also have an expansionist perspective on what it's supposed to be. So when you, for example, and I want to make this point clear on what I'm saying because some I'm sure people will be like, what is he talking about? For anyone who's never lived in Haiti or spent time learning the history like on the ground in Haiti, when you're in Haiti, there's much made about these old castles and these old spaces in which the early revolutionaries established for themselves and for their families. But what you come to realize is that prior to that, in 1804, none of these castles and things existed. The only thing that existed across the entire island were forts. And these weren't forts that were built and taken up by the Africans, taken up from the French before them. These were forts that were built by us. And there's an entire network of tunnels going all through the island and even outside of the island, which allowed for the military conquest. So when we think about Haiti and what happened, what allowed us to win, it wasn't only that it was extremely mountainous. It wasn't only that we rose up. It was a topographical strategy. We knew the terrain, but we also knew these tunnels and established them. And so we could go underground in one place and the enemy would think we were in Port-au-Prince, and then we pop up in Okai. We pop up in the north of the country. We pop up on the east side. And people didn't see us marching there. They didn't see us navigating the terrain to get there. It's like, how did they get there? We were traveling underground. These forts are connected to these tunnels. There were no castles. There was nothing that would indicate that Haiti was a place where you have a president and his palace. It was a military space to advance an empire of liberty, which was the name of Haiti and its establishment. It was just a space where people could come and they could get free, and that a space that could be defended against imperialism of the enslavement class in the world at that time, and expand an empire that, if it were successful, would have reached all the way through the modern day United States, would have reached throughout the Caribbean, would have reached throughout South America. And so it was never supposed to be what it is today. So when people say, like, well, how do we make it work? What exists today was never designed to work. So if we take Haiti, the sliver of an island that it currently is, in spite of the fact that it used to be the entire island of modern day Haiti and Dominican Republic, then in some ways we're bound to fail because we're trying to make a failed project work. We're trying to work on a car that has already been totaled. So we've got to rethink Haiti. Perhaps it can't be that military base of liberatory expansion anymore in the 21st century. We may not be able to get back to the original vision, but my position is that we have to have a new vision. We have to figure out something different, because if we just want to get elections and get a president or a prime minister in a nation that is ever shrinking by design, we're going to continue to hit roadblocks and continue to hit brick walls and continue to stall on the road. So we have to get people together who are a think tank, if you will, a Pan-Africanist think tank that can come together and say, you know what, we're experienced in nation building for African people. Let's make this work internationally, a real international community, not the core group of exploitative capitalists that like to exploit and call themselves the international community. We need a Pan-Africanist international community to get together and figure things out, just like we're doing across the African world, to make the best decisions for how African statecraft will work in the 21st century. Because we're breaking down these colonies in Africa. We know they weren't designed to be successful nation states. So we have to reformulate that. We have to do the same thing in Haiti. That's just my position.
No, I really appreciate that actually, because oftentimes when we speak of the continent today and talking about China's role in the continent and the economies in Africa, we quickly realize, or we understand, that the conversation shouldn't even be directed at China in this way, because our economies and our countries were structured in such a way to facilitate greater exploitation. So I really appreciate this notion of statecraft in the post-colonial era. What does it look like? And I like how you also mentioned Pan-Africanist, like a Pan-Africanist take. And I guess we're not going to be talking about, we don't mean the president of Kenya who is chomping at the bit to invade Haiti, and other African leaders and other countries right now who, I guess, to the highest bid are willing to do the US's dirty work. Or we see the comprador classes in the United States. I think it was a Reverend Al Sharpton alongside Mayor Eric Adams, and they were saying we have to go and help our brothers in Haiti, our brothers and sisters in Haiti. So I just wanted to kind of ask you, what is it about this moment specifically that has all these countries chomping at the bit to launch an invasion of Haiti right now?
I think it's because, as I mentioned before, it's a very rare space and time. And it's similar. It's even rarer than the Duvalier regime ending, where you had that 3-year window of, okay, what's next? Because at least in that, because their puppet and baby Doc was not assassinated, he was ousted, and so they had time to figure out the next steps. In this case, their puppet Jovenel Moise was assassinated. It happened at a point in which he was executing a plan of wiping the slate clean, because there were no elected officials. There were 11, actually. There were 11 elected officials still in the country. And of course, there are none now. So what he was doing was the final phase of a democratic exportation structure in IET, where you went from populous 90+% voter engagement to less than 20%. And you also had a restructuring of the political class. that was being completed so it can be completely reformulated under that single party proxy system, the PSTK. But his assassination cut that short. And so now you have a situation like Brother Christian said, it's a vacuum. There's a lot of things that are unpredictable. And that unpredictability makes empire uneasy because it's an easy opportunity for the enemies of empire to get in and take root and cause problems for the empire. So I do want to say that even though in that light, in that spirit, even though these gangs, these mercenaries are not revolutionaries now, we invite them to become revolutionaries. Because if they become revolutionaries, it changes everything. So please, we want them to become revolutionaries and realize that the opportunity is now to seize the day, take our collective destiny in our hands, and then move the nation forward for the benefit of everybody. And I think if they do that and they work hand in hand with the real revolutionaries in IET who have taken a principled position to assist the people and uplift the people through programs like the clinics, like the food programs, like the education, so on and so forth, then there will be amnesty situation, a situation in which they're provided forgiveness for what they did because now they're on the right side of history, just like Bookman Duddy, who is lauded in history as a preeminent revolutionary of the Haitian Revolution. He didn't start that way. He was an overseer in the plantations before he became a revolutionary. And so the revolutionaries of his time didn't kill him. They saw his potential and they invited him to revolution and he responded and he's remembered well for that. So that offer is still on the table for all of these mercenaries in IET who operate as enemies of revolution to take up the spirit of revolution, become revolutionaries, and be remembered well in history by their children.
Thank you for that. In that, I think it's interesting the work that you're alluding to that needs to be done, especially from a Pan-African perspective. And one of the kind of major dilemmas that I always think about with regards to a Pan-African politic is the fact that there there's a great number of those in the diaspora that live in the global north or the west that need to or want to contribute to some sort of libertary project for African peoples in the global south. And in many ways, the terrain is different for those who are located geographically in different areas. So, what do you think the task is for those who sit in the West, who for those in the global North? I mean, like before we got on this, I was asking where you're based out of, and I was telling you I'm based out of Brooklyn. There's plenty of Haitians in Flatbush here in Brooklyn, in New York City in general. There's a lot of Haitians in Florida, but there's a struggle going on back home right now, and if you could speak to all of those, not just Haitians, but also just members of the diaspora, Black people who care about Pan-African liberation, what would you say for them to do?
Join an organization that is doing the work that they want to see get. And if they can't find an organization that is doing that work, create it and invite others into it. So I mentioned, I think in the beginning of this conversation, that IET, among the places that I've spent significant time or have lived, is one of the most organized, if not the most organized space. In that the people see themselves as a collective, and anything that needs to get done, they do together and create an organization for it. It doesn't matter how long the organization, we don't need to create permanent organizations. We just need to create permanency among our people moving forward. So you can have an organization that exists only to create momentum to accomplish a single goal. And once that goal is achieved, then the organization dissolves. Mission accomplished. We don't need the organization anymore. We don't have to figure out how to keep the organization alive. The people are alive and the goal has been accomplished. On to the next. So find an organization in the community, create an organization in the community. We live in a time in which people are in constant conversation, which is another unique aspect of the 21st century. The movements, the successful movements of our ancestors and our elders did not have the benefit of mass media like social media and the things that we're using right now, this podcasting platform. So we see an ebb and flow in their movements of approximately 30 years when they and that's a generational thing, I think. where they're successful in something, and then there's a dip in activity, and then the next generation rises up and is successful in something, and then there's a dip, and then we see that pattern. Well, that's because they were getting together, and their communication around goals or organization was when they happened to meet, and that might happen once a week, once a month, once a quarter, so on and so forth. The information that was shared would have to be come out in print in newspapers, and there was a slower process of sharing information. Well, today you can have organizers in constant communication, which is unique, to not have to wait for a meeting to deal with meeting organizational business, because you're dealing with it constantly through social media. So let's take advantage of actually establishing these organizations with clear objectives, getting people in there, and then starting using these social media platforms to stay in constant communication, to build toward this mass character that is needed and that is part of our culture. So I would invite anyone to KOSA. Website is KOSSSA.com. So you can get more information there if you would like. Then, because that is an organization that is based in Haiti, I just serve as the international representative because of my mobility. But beyond that, travel. Everybody, I understand, doesn't have the means to travel internationally, but travel out of your community. Go see what your brothers and sisters in other places are doing. Like you mentioned, there are Haitian communities all over the place. So find another Haitian community and try to travel there and communicate with brothers and sisters there if you have the opportunity. And if you don't, just try to create the opportunity. If you can travel internationally, do so, because that heightens your perspective and your range of organization and operation. I'm a citizen in Africa too. I have Sierra Leonean citizenship. And so I have mobility in Africa that allows me to organize among people in Africa, that if I did not have citizenship, then I wouldn't be able to do that as well. And so the Western Hemisphere, we're not slaves anymore. We're not locked down to a colony anymore. Let's see ways that we can be free people and move about. Our ancestors did it somehow, some way. We can do it too, and we should do it.
Thank you so much, comrade. And on that note, I'm going to wrap up the show. But honestly, this has been a super insightful conversation, and one that I think we must have again and again and again. So I thank you for your time. I'm going to leave Comrade Kweku Lumumba's, I guess, the website that he mentioned in the episode description. And this is something I think we should take heed to. I think the global contradictions are continually sharpening, and it's about time we continue to be on the right side of history, or get on the right side of history.
Yeah.
So until next time, thank you so much.